Can you join? Hey,
How are
sorry
you?
about good. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you.
Sorry. So today I'm gonna be hosting Mike Young, the director of Athletic Lab. So Mike, can you introduce yourself for the coaches in Taiwan?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. My name's Mike Young. I straddle between sports science and coaching. I have worked as a researcher for a couple different organizations and have my PhD in biomechanics as well as a master's in physiology and a PhD minor in physiology. I currently run Athletic Lab, a sports performance training center, where we also do research in North Carolina. That's the east coast of North Carolina. And there I work with primarily elite athletes. I have a lot of elite level track and field athletes who I work with, as well as a football club or soccer club, if you will. And I also train quite a few professional basketball players. The business itself, however, works with many individuals from the youth developmental athlete all the way through elite professionals in a variety of sports. So I'm heavily invested in sports science, coaching, education, and research as well. I'm still relatively actively involved both in terms of applied sports science as well as peer-reviewed sports science.
Thank you. So today's question I gathered these questions from some of the coaches in Taiwan. So are you ready to start?
Sure.
Okay. So the first thing would be I'm interested in the thing you posted on Instagram, some of the eccentric training. How do you use eccentric training and when, and is there a protocol, and how do I combine it with traditional weight training?
Sure. So that's a great question. We implement some form of eccentric training very early on. I feel like most athletes neglect the role that eccentric training plays in the development of performance as well as the reduction of injury. So we start to address it relatively early on using simple means such as slow, controlled tempos and sub-maximal loads, along with lower intensity plyometric type activities. This allows the athlete, starting from a younger age or a lower developmental stage, to develop the tissue tolerance for the higher loading that we eventually want to get to. So this progresses over time to where we are incorporating maximal concentric loads and then exceeding maximal concentric loads for eccentric loads in the gym. So this is using loads on the bar that perhaps are anywhere up to 130% of an individual's maximum for a given lift. Eccentrically, we're significantly stronger, anywhere on the range of 15 to 200% stronger than we are concentrically. So to reach stimulus threshold for a more highly trained individual, you need to be training with loads in the gym that are in excess of the person's concentric maximum. Now, we're also addressing things with plyometrics as well. So in the gym, we're progressing up in terms of the loading, attempting to control the descent as much as possible. But in terms of plyometrics, we're starting with lower level plyometrics and gradually progressing to the stage where we are doing accentuated even plyometrics, perhaps doing depth drops or depth jumps. I've even progressed some athletes to where we're doing bounding activities off of boxes. So we actually accentuate the ground reaction forces at impact. So we get loads at ground contact that are somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 times body weight on a single leg sometimes, with with these plyometrics. But this is something that I'm quite careful to progress up to with lower level athletes, lower training ages, less experienced athletes. You don't need to jump into this. In fact, what I would say is that it takes years for me to get to these more advanced plyometrics and advanced weight training schemes. With my track and field athletes who are on the most developed side of that continuum, you know, they're already have a high training age when they come to me. They've gone through college, and then we just expand on that. I take that a couple steps further, but even then it takes as much as 12 months to get to these really high level eccentric loading. So I'm very careful. If I were to have someone who was brand new to training, I wouldn't really try to address accentuated eccentric loading where we're trying to get really, really high with these eccentric loads. We might do something where it's just lower level standard training, which it should basically look like normal training, perhaps incorporating some slower tempos into the weight room or some controlled exposure to landing on plyometrics activities, because the tissue stress has to build, it has to accumulate over time for you to be able to handle these things. Because we are so strong eccentrically, you need to make sure that you progress gradually to the point where you're getting to these really high loads. Like, even though we're stronger, the tissue may not be able to withstand that loading in a safe manner. So we want to make sure that we ramp it up gradually over time.
Okay, so it's kind of like traditional like periodization. So we're gonna use it like lighter loads before and gradually increase to max strength. And after that, there's gonna be like a picture on the Athletic Lab Instagram, I believe. It's like concentric loading and sub-maximal isometric, eccentric loading, maximal isometric, and accentuated, eccentric, then shock method, right?
That's correct. Yep. And that progression, it's unnecessary for less advanced athletes or people who aren't competing in speed and power sports to really get to that end stages of the continuum. I think everyone should start off with the traditional max strength work. Everyone should start off with some small exposure to controlled tempo, eccentrics and both maximal and submaximal eccentrics. But getting into that maximal eccentrics and the shock loading is something that I don't think is really necessary for most athletes, and is certainly not something you should just jump into. I think you need to take your time to get to that point.
But how about like field athletes, like basketball player, like football player?
So with team and court sport athletes, my experience is that I would like to expose them to those stresses. However, in most cases, when I train them, and I've mostly worked in North America, so I've consulted a little bit overseas, but in my experience, most of them, while they might be elite in their respective sport, are not very physically developed. So what I mean by that is that they can shoot a ball or they can kick a ball very well. However, when it comes to actually the training side of things, that they may lack the underpinning physical qualities. So they may be perhaps a national team player on the basketball team, or they may play soccer or football professionally. However, if you ask them to do a squat, they may actually not even be able to squat their own body weight for a single rep or two. So they don't need, even though they're elite in their sport or very high level in their sport, they don't need to progress to elite stimuli to see progress. They can stay on the things that are quite boring, really, the concentric work, the just basic fundamental movement pattern progressions, and then master those. And until they get to a reasonably high level, and I sometimes talk about a 2 times body weight squat as a good metric to hold. It's nothing magical about that, but and I don't necessarily prevent athletes who don't have a 2 times body weight squat to move on to other more advanced exercises. But I think it is the premise that you need to have these basic qualities in place before the more advanced quality training stimuli even are necessary is important to understand. We don't need to do the things that are very, very advanced, very, very challenging to the neuromuscular system, to the soft tissue, etc., when things that are much simpler will yield gains just as well in a beginning athlete. If you're a novice, you don't need to do advanced things. You know, if we all understand that we couldn't take college math, let's say college age calculus, university calculus, and teach it to a kindergartner and expect for them to do well, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to training, oftentimes we take the things that are reserved, best suited for the most advanced individuals and try to apply it to someone who is really the equivalent of a child, a novice, an early grade school student. So what we want to think of is what's best suited for the individual in their stage of physical development, not necessarily sport development. We sometimes see athletes who are very skilled and they can compete at a high level in their sport, but they don't have the physical development. From a physical development perspective, they're actually quite novices.
Yeah. So if I want to like put these kind of like eccentric training thing in my like my training philosophy or like my schedule, like what thing like, is there a data thing for me to see? So I think like the lack of eccentric strength, so I put it in.
Sure. So usually what I would say is I would look for some baseline level of concentric strength. If you don't have relatively high concentric strength, you can develop eccentric capacities simply by developing concentric capacities. There is a transfer effect. So first thing is make sure that you're relatively strong concentrically. It doesn't have to be elite levels of concentric strength, but you have to be relatively strong concentrically. Once we have had a year to at least exposure to just traditional weight room methodology, at least that, then we can start to expose them to more advanced methods. And then the eccentrics and the isometrics, submaximal in nature, can be something as simple as just adding pauses to the motions or just adding a slow controlled descent to those same exercises that you were doing to develop concentric strength. And then in terms of the plyometrics, doing activities such as low-level plyometrics, what I'd call baby bounds, where we're just doing repeated jumps, sub-maximal effort, are great for athletes, even for those who are competing in jumping like sports such as basketball and volleyball. A lot of times what I look for is not only what does the sport require, right? But in some cases, you have to look at things like what does the sport not provide? So for example, in the sport of basketball, they already jump maximally many, many times. In the sport of volleyball, all they do is jump maximally and have a lateral movement. So if all I were to do is focus on those very same things, I'm not supplementing what they're already seeing from their sport. So what can I do as the S&C coach, the strength coach, to make them a more resilient athlete, to enhance the qualities that are so important for their actual sport? So a lot of times it's not necessarily going to be the exact same thing that they see in their sport, right? A volleyball player probably doesn't need to do a lot more maximal jumping because they're literally doing that dozens of times every single practice. What they need is developing tissue resilience and so forth. So maybe some max strength for them might be important. Likewise, for a soccer player, having a ball at their feet all the time is not necessarily going to be the best way to enhance their physical qualities. It's certainly going to be something that you might want to see, but you need to address other things as well. So the game itself does have some carryover and helps development of physical capacities, but the game is specific to the game. I want to develop things that are specific to the physical qualities that I want to develop. So those are oftentimes going to be other training methods that might not be seen in the game itself.
Thank you for explaining it to me, like so detailed. Thank you.
Sure.
So I followed your Instagram, and there's sometimes you posted like reactive strength index. So can you explain it to us, like what is reactive strength index and how to use it for designing the training program?
Sure. So reactive strength index is a metric that is based off of an individual's ability to jump and produce. It's typically a jump test. It can be conducted in a variety of different ways, and it's assessing not just how high you jump, but also how quickly you can produce force. So a lot of times we use jump tests as an indicator of lower extremity power. The vertical jump test, where you jump as high as you can, is probably one of the most commonly used lower extremity power tests. However, the problem is that research shows that people can jump high using different strategies. Even the same individual can jump high regardless of where they are in terms of their training readiness. So you can be very fatigued and still jump equally high using a different strategy. Lower counter movement, longer expression of force, that kind of thing. But what RSI does is assess how high you jump and how long it took you on the ground to produce the force necessary for that jump. So this is a much more sensitive test to fatigue, and it's a better indicator of qualities that are important for sport. So in sport, we don't typically just stand in place and have a really long time to produce force. In most sports, you're required to produce force really, really quickly. And that's what we would call reactive strength. You know, how not just how much force you can produce, but how quickly you can produce that force. So RSI is an index, reactive strength index, of those qualities. How quickly can you produce the force? Typically, it's performed as a repeated jump test. You jump anywhere between 5 and 10 times. Sometimes it's performed from boxes. In all cases, again, it's an index of how high you jump relative to for example, over how long it took you on the ground. The most commonly used measure is jump height over ground contact time. And then you get a number that would range anywhere between 0.5 and about 4 units of RSI. A very good score would be somewhere in the range of 3 to 4, in my experience. That would be an elite level score, somewhere in the range of 3 to 4. And this can be useful in a couple different ways. RSI is good because it's super sensitive to fatigue. So if you're looking for a test that can indicate how fatigued an athlete is, how ready they are to train, RSI is very sensitive. Conversely, vertical jump is not. If we did vertical jump, someone could be very fatigued and jump to just as high as if they were not fatigued, because you can produce force in different ways, longer range of motion, longer expression of force, etc. if you're fatigued, and achieve the same result. That's not the case with RSI. The other thing that it can be useful for is kind of identifying the strengths and weaknesses of an athlete. If you put the RSI test in the context of a larger test battery, so for example, you test RSI, but you also test measures of strength and maybe even more static measures of jumping. So you could do a standing vertical jump, you could do a counter movement jump, and then you could do RSI. And what those three things give you is different points on the force velocity continuum. And you can start to see whether someone is better at producing force or power slowly, which would be the standing vertical jump, or if they're better at producing force very elastically. If someone was really, really good at the RSI and not so great at the standing vertical jump, perhaps they would actually benefit from increased maximal strength development. If someone was really good at the standing vertical jump, but very poor in the RSI, now you could determine that we could probably stop developing RSI or stop developing maximal strength and focus more on stiffness related plyometrics, where someone is working on shorter ground contact times and being able to produce force very, very quickly. So RSI is a really nice test. It's something that I've increasingly used over the past couple of years. I think that it provides a lot of information both for assessing training readiness, like effectively as a monitoring tool, but also to determine what needs to be trained for the athlete. So with a lot of my athletes, I'll use RSI once a week or a couple times a month to get an indication of how the training is impacting them in terms of fatigue. And then I'll also use it as a performance indicator, because there's a good bit of research which actually shows that RSI, more than all of your other jumping tests, is actually correlated with maximal velocity sprinting and even change of direction. So the ability to produce force really, really quickly is what the RSI tests, and that's why it would correlate really well with something like max velocity sprinting, where the ground contact times are so incredibly short, or change of direction, where you have huge eccentric loads and then have a change of direction.
Yeah. So I'm gonna jump into the next question. So I also saw you use velocity-based training. So is it like certain time in the year you use that, or like all around the year? Like monitoring the bar speed.
Sure. So I do like velocity-based training. The technology is one of my most widely implemented. We typically use push bands for our RSI for our VBT. I use it throughout the year with different populations. It's most commonly used with my track and field athletes. We use it for a variety of different purposes. This could be an entire lecture unto itself, but I would say if I were to distill the reason I use VBT down to one reason, the most primary reason, is to drive intent. So we get real-time feedback. They have an iPad in front of them, and on every single rep, they can see how fast they move the bar. So I want them to try to move the bar as quickly as possible and produce as much force as possible. Now, with this idea of driving intent, making sure that they're motivated to move their body in the bar as quickly as possible, there are several other benefits that come out of that. So sometimes what I can do is do repetitions until we see a velocity drop off. So for example, I could instead of prescribing sets by the number of reps, I could say I want you to do repetitions until the velocity drops by 15%. And that would ensure that the power output remains very high, but the fatigue is very low. So this can be very useful during periods where we're trying to compete perhaps, or I'm focusing on power development. Another way that I could use it in a similar manner is I could not prescribe a load. So I could just say, let's do 6 sets of 2 snatches. So 6 sets of 2 snatches. And I could let the athlete start light, and I could say, you can put as much weight on the bar as you'd like, but when the power output starts to drop, I want you to drop the weight. So you can go up as high as you want, but when the power output on the real-time feedback begins to drop, that's when I need you to back down on the weight. And then we just, instead of lifting for load, we lift to maximize power. I've used it for a variety of other reasons as well. You can use different velocity cutoffs. So most of the time I'll use very high range cutoffs. So for example, 15%. Once the velocity drops 15 or 20%, we shut down the set. But if we were training for, say, work capacity or muscular endurance or hypertrophy even, we could use a higher threshold. So doing repetitions until velocity dropped by 30 or 35%. But any way you look at it, what I'm trying to do is get that real-time feedback. They can compete against each other. They can compete against themselves, and then we can make sure that they're motivated. You know, I've had situations where 10 athletes all have, say, 5 sets of 3 back squats. They were all prescribed 5 sets of 3 back squats at 85%. So they all have 85% of their back squat max on the bar, and they are all of different strengths. Some athletes may be very strong, other athletes may be weaker, but they all have 85% in the bar. Now, what's interesting here is that we can get them to compete, and they can all see how fast they can move their own 85%. So I may be a little bit weaker than another individual, but if I can move my bar faster than him, now I'm held accountable. It turns into a competition, and everybody wants to win this competition. So it makes the training more competitive. It makes it more fun. When the athletes do their sets, they're very engaged. Instead of just going through the motion, they really try very hard every single rep. And there's some really fascinating research which suggests that using this real-time feedback during weight training sessions can actually enhance the transfer of training to the things that we really care about, which is running faster, jumping higher, and quicker change of direction. So I have increasingly used these 80 to 85% loads with the velocity-based training measures, and really just had the athletes focus on trying to move it as fast as possible. If we move the same load faster, we know that the individual is more powerful, and we can probably guesstimate that the athlete is also stronger, even though we are not testing them or using these really super high loads like 90 or 95%. Because if you can move a sub-maximal load faster, it certainly means you're more powerful. And at that 80 to 85%, if we're moving that faster than we were previously, now we can be pretty certain that our maximum strength has also gone up. So it's a good monitoring tool. It's a good motivational tool. It's something that I like to use quite a bit. It's not, VBT has many, many benefits. I have entire lectures on VBT, but this is probably my primary reason why I use it, is to motivate athletes, to get them to compete against each other, to increase the transfer of training of the weight room to the sporting tasks or more athletic tasks.
Okay. So, but here's like one thing I heard it from Dan Baker, is like where he's gonna train max strength, like maximal strength. He's like, he don't care about the velocity loss. As long as the athlete's technique is good, he's not going to care about the velocity loss. Because when we train like max, like 3 RM back squat, the first, he says, going to be like 0.3, like 8. The second is going to be like 0.3, like 2 or 3. And the last rep is going to be like below 0.3. It's probably going to be like 0.28. But he said like he's going to still train them because he knows that the velocity loss is going to be huge. But if you want to like increase the max strength, you have to still do it as long as the technique is like perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm pretty well in agreement with that. Dan Baker and I are good friends, and we are pretty comparable. The difference, I think, in this discussion is that he's talking about maximum strength, and I rarely actually use VBT in max strength settings, just simply because when you're using maximum strength loads, somewhere in the range of 90% or so, that you're right, the velocity is already going to be quite low. For a highly trained individual, those velocities may be as low as like 0.1 meters per second for an activity like the bench press. So I don't even see that I don't even really use VBT when we're truly focusing on maximum strength. I use it more when we're trying to develop what I'd call low-end power, so the ability to move reasonably heavy loads, but not maximal fast. I think I think where you can use it in max strength settings is, however, to look at like at 90%. If you were to do, say, 2 repetitions at 90%, how quickly do you move it? That kind of thing. But velocity drop-off at 90%, your first rep is going to be quite low to begin with. And your second rep is going to be even lower. So I don't know that it is going to serve much purpose, because you're only going to be able to do 2 or 3 repetitions as it is. You can't cut it off at 1 or 2 reps earlier. So typically my thresholds are very, very high. Maintenance of 85% velocity. Dan and I have actually spoken on this, and I think he uses a slightly more conservative estimate. So he would say maintain 20% for power outputs, or 25%. And I say go, for my athletes who tend to be a little bit more oriented towards the speed side of the speed power spectrum than Dan's, I will say 15, he'll say 20%. So quite interesting, but philosophically we're almost identical. I don't really even use VBT for those super, super heavy loads.
So I don't want to be disrespectful, but just kind of want to ask that question.
Sure, no problem. Dan and I are perfectly in line with each other. And even if we weren't, I think he's a very accomplished coach who he certainly and has done a lot of work with VBT. He's one of the leaders in VBT. So I think anytime he speaks, you should listen.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, I'm going to jump into the next one. Correct me if I'm wrong. So the thing I saw you on Instagram, it's more like traditional periodization, right? It's like linear periodization. Same as what I just mentioned, the picture on Instagram, I forgot it, concentric, then eccentric, then shock method, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So, but what I would clarify there, though, is that largely what I post on Instagram is track and field athletes. So in track and field and other sports that are what I'd call quantifiable sports, performance-oriented sports, activities like track and field, swimming, cycling, weightlifting, powerlifting, perhaps rowing. In those sports, linear periodization is going to work well. More traditional periodization, where we have a very clearly defined general prep period, a very clearly defined special prep period, a very clearly defined competitive period. In those activities, we're moving towards one very important competition, whether that's your world championships or your Olympic Games or whatever it is. Now, that's not the case in team sports. So I do work a lot in team sports. I'm the performance director for the North Carolina Courage. We've been very successful over the years. I've worked in a couple other different team sports settings, rugby and other higher level soccer clubs, and increasingly work in the sport of basketball. In these team sports, there's no one competition that is the most important. In team sports, almost every competition is as important as the other competitions. The games are just as important. If you play a 32 match season in your sport, whether that's basketball or soccer, the first game of the regular season is basically as important in terms of the standings as the last game. So in these cases, you don't have a linear periodization. What you have is what I call an agile periodization or an undulating periodization. So you have to, each week, you will let the competitions, the matches, the games, dictate your periodization plan. So the basic concepts of traditional periodization will hold true, but the application of them will not. So what are the basic concepts? Well, you have to have an overload if you want to get better. Overload is primarily going to come from volume or intensity. If you want to maintain, the best way to do it is going to be to release, maintain intensity. We need to manipulate frequency. We need to manipulate the density of training. And then we want to make sure that we are recovered for when we need to perform. So those are the basic concepts of periodization, right? It doesn't matter whether I have a 52 weeks till my most important competition, and that's by far the most important competition of the year, or if I play a match or a game every Saturday, I need to be ready for that match every Saturday. So on the annual plan, if it's 52 weeks and it's a track and field athlete or a weightlifter, we all have a basic understanding of what should be done. But if we're working with team sport athletes, now we almost need to compress that 52 weeks down into 7 days. So we know that Saturday is our game or our match. That means that Friday, we probably need to go a little bit easier. Thursday, we can train a little bit heavier. Wednesday, we can train very hard. Tuesday, we can probably go a little bit lighter. And Monday, we can go hard again. So we still have this undulation of loading, just as we would see in the annual plan. But now instead of it being 52 weeks long and this very extended drop in volume and an increase in intensity, now we're going to take those same curves and crunch them down into a 7-day period. Basically, if you have time to train, that you put in the training. The interesting thing with training is that the immediate impact of training physical qualities is for those physical qualities to probably get worse, right? If I train very hard in the weight room, the day after, maybe 2 days later, I'm actually sore, I'm fatigued, I'm going to perform worse. But 3 days later, 4 days later, now I'm actually better. But we need to keep in mind that to get better, we need to train. But if we and to perform well, we need to rest. But if I'm not balancing the rest with the training, then I'm just going to either be over fatigued or under trained. So regardless of whether we're talking about a 52-week season or we're talking about a 7-day cycle for team sports, we're balancing the ability to train and the ability and the need to rest. So determining when we need to be able to perform and when we can fit in training to actually get better.
Thank you. So next one would be, what are the thoughts on overspeed training, like assistance jump or like assistance run? And the other things would be like assistance lateral movement, like shuffle and crossovers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't typically use overspeed work. In the traditional sense. So I have used what could effectively be considered overspeed acceleration. So I use some bands to really rapidly get someone through the acceleration phase and up to top speed sprinting, but they never actually run faster than they're capable of without the bands. All I'm doing there is just rushing their acceleration phase. It's effectively the same as if they were running downhill. I will use assisted jumping activities with some of my more advanced athletes. For example, we can hold a band and do repeated jumps in a vertical direction using a band. What that does is train the athlete to produce force faster. And then we could also do, but with change of direction activities, typically what I'll do is resisted change of direction activities. Now, it's a little bit complex here because sometimes on my resisted change of direction activities, I will use a band, an elastic band. And with an elastic band, what it does do is accelerate the athlete into the change of direction. So if, for example, I had a band that was attached over here and the athlete accelerates out in this direction, and now they come back, their return is accelerated to a greater extent. So it's slightly accelerated loading on that change of direction. I do use that quite a bit. I found it's been very, very useful. But one thing that I have not been doing, have not done, is true overspeed maximal velocity sprinting. If I had a 1080 sprint or one of these devices that could do it in a very controlled manner, then I might consider it, but I don't have one of those on site right now. So I don't believe traditional towing for sprinting is an effective or safe mechanism. If I had an activity that could control the towing, control the assistance, I might consider it. Or if I had a very, very slight downhill grade, I might consider it. So if I had a track surface that was negative 2 or 3 degrees downhill, then I might consider using that for overspeed running as well.
Thank you. So there's like the assisted change of direction you just mentioned. So if I like put it over here, then the athlete's on here, move it like over like here and back to here. Do you like want the athlete to still go out or just like hold it?
I'll sometimes do it repeatedly. So we might do 6 or so shuffles out. We might even do it forward and backward. So in a given set. So a couple of different repetitions, a couple different ways of doing it. Sometimes I'll introduce some variability so it's not very predictable. They might have to go to a target or to a light.
Okay. And the other thing would be on the assistance jump. So with the band, basically the force we put on the ground would be like lesser.
That's right. So on an assisted jump, the force is probably less, almost certainly is less. I have not done it with one of our force platforms, but it's probably less. But the time is also less. So what you're doing there is not training the ability to produce force. We're training the ability to produce force fast. So instead of overloading the force component to it by doing it unassisted or perhaps even putting on a resisted harness, a resisted vest or something, what we're doing is overloading. We're making it more difficult to produce force because we're shortening the time in which they can produce the force.
And the last one would be the future of you and the athletic lab.
So I'm going to continue to educate. We have a coaching academy that we launched 4 months ago. It's available online. I saw my friend Josh is on here, who has brought me out to Taiwan on a couple occasions, and hope to make it back at some point. Hopefully when COVID is clear around the world, I'll continue to educate. But until that time, our coaching academy, which is available at athleticlabacademy.com, is on sale actually for this month. And we offer our level 1 certification, something that I've actually taught in Taiwan previously. And it's a great course, talks about several of the things I've discussed here, including periodization and eccentric training and strength training and speed development. And I see several of my Brazilian and Portuguese friends on here as well, who have also gone through the course. So if you haven't checked that out, we'd greatly appreciate you do, and give us any feedback that you might have.
Okay. So I just finished the course and I passed the test. And I want to tell you that I'm a big fan of you. I follow your work. Thank you for answering all these questions. It helps a lot.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So I kind of like ask these questions, like focus on those a little bit detail. Sorry about that, because there's going to be like physical therapists and like people who want to be trainers will be watching this on YouTube. So I kind of want to like ask it for them.
Sure.
So anyway, thank you very much.
No problem. You should tell people how we met.
Yeah. Okay, we met it on like outside of a movie theater, and I asked for a photo with you.
I was in Taiwan speaking and walking around, and then someone came up to me who I never met before, and it happened to be. I went home and was able to tell someone that I went halfway around the world, and someone recognized me. It felt like a small celebrity.
I was truly a big fan. I follow your work. Is there going to be a level 2 online?
We're working on it. It will probably be about a year away, though.
Okay. Thank you. I wish I could host you another time.
Sounds good. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. See you.
Take care. Bye.
So that's all for today. And later tonight, we're going to be hosting Bill Miller. See you all.